Welcome to the Art Plus Music Plus Technology podcast. This episode is brought to you by the zZyzx Society, the electronic music ensemble of Jill Frazier and Peter Grenader, with their upcoming release on ZSR Records featuring Tool drummer Danny Carey and Thy Paul Sandra of Coil and UUUU. Available soon on iTunes and as a CD at steveroach.com, with liner notes on their site at zZyzxsociety.com. That's zZyzx, zZyzx, society.com. Now enjoy this interview with Nyle Steiner. Okay, today I have the great pleasure of speaking to one of the people who I consider kind of a touchstone for all the electronic music work that we do. His name's Nyle Steiner. He has had his fingers in a lot of amazing work. Now, rather than try and list them all myself, I'll see if we can make him list them. So with that, I'm going to say hi to Nyle. Hey, Nyle, how are you?
I'm fine.
I really appreciate you taking the time to have this chat. Why don't we start off by having you tell people just kind of the thumbnail version of how you identify yourself?
Well, I've been known for designing electronic music, synthesizer type things, and also I worked in the studios in L.A. for about 20 years, underscoring movies and TV, playing an instrument I call an electronic valve instrument. I call it that because I fashioned it with fingering like a trumpet, because that's what I used to play. And I've been around late 70s, I finally got it working well enough I could play it professionally. I started in the early 70s designing it. The first instruments I built were keyboard synthesizers, but I don't play keyboard very well, so I started experimenting around with something that could be played kind of like a trumpet. Mm-hmm. And so I started making that, and that finally got to the point where I could start playing it professionally. I went to California in around 1979. I started working on the movie Apocalypse Now, and that worked out pretty well. Most of that work was done in San Francisco. But then afterwards, I moved to Los Angeles area and worked in the studios quite regularly until around the year 2000. And so I had about a 20-year span of working. Before I went to the studios, I had a company building synthesizers. It was called Steiner Parker. A friend of mine named Parker designed most of the cabinetry, and I designed the circuits.
I see.
And we built modular synthesizer, and then we made a compact one called the Synthicon, which now I've seen them sell for close to $10,000 or in the $9,000 range on eBay. They sold for a lot less than that when we made them.
Right. The person who got us in contact was Peter Grenader, and he said to me that one of the things that I should ask you about is your first modular that you had done with Vladimir Yushchevsky at the University of Utah. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is. I was starting to experiment with synthesizers on my own a little while before that. And Yushchevsky came to the University of Utah as a composer in residence and electronic music professor. He started a studio there, and there wasn't anybody else I knew in the area that was interested in electronic music, so I was quite intrigued by the fact that this professor was teaching electronic music at the University of Utah. And at the time I wasn't enrolled, but I asked him, I approached him and said, can I come and audit your electronic music class? He was giving a musicology class on electronic music composers and things like that. Mm-hmm. He said, sure, you can come and sit in. So I just came and sat in on his classes, and then I got to know him and showed him what I was building as a synthesizer, and he became quite interested and says, why don't you build one for the university? Would you be willing to build a modular synthesizer for the University of Utah? And so I started doing that, and that was the first modular synthesizer that I had built for anybody else. other than myself. And I was still experimenting at the time, designing circuits. So I was designing circuits and building for the University of Utah kind of at the same time, because I started building theirs before I had a whole lot done on my own system. My own system was kind of small, and so I kind of built my own system and theirs at the same time. They grew together.
I see.
And then after that, a friend named Parker, he's also worked on, we were working together in a company in the electronic engineering department. He said, let's start making some of these. So, and he was very good at doing woodwork as well as had knowledge of electronics. And he said he would design the cabinets and design the hardware, and you design the modules, because I was into electronic music at that time and had quite an interest in designing electronic music modules and devices. And so we started making synthesizers in his basement at that time. That was around 1975.
And these were full-on modular systems?
Yeah, we started making modular systems that you patch with patch cords. Then later we decided to make one that was more compact, where you didn't have to use patch cords, but had a lot of switches that you could route the signals. And it had quite a number of switches along the bottom of a row of, where it had a bunch of knobs above these switches. And we called that the Synthicon. And that was like a 4-octave keyboard with a thin panel on the top, long thin panel, and it did similar things to what the modular synthesizer would do. I think at the time, I don't know, it was one of the more popular synthesizers. We were just, making our own. But now they've become quite popular, and on eBay they sell for quite a bit. And I think we sold them for around $1,400 back then, is what we were selling them for.
Yeah, so that was a Synthicon. That my understanding is that it had a real peculiar sound, and I think a lot of people sort of focus their attention on the filter that was part of that. And I mean, to the point where now what's considered a Steiner filter is even a highly sought after sound, just like in modern modular gear as well, right?
It seems that has become the case, and Arturia has put the Steiner filter in a number of their products now that they sell. Right. Analog synthesizers. And at the time, I was just interested in making my own filter that wasn't going to infringe on patents of Moog and ARP and stuff like that. And right. Nobody ever approached me and says, hey, you're infringing on our patents. So I guess it was...
you did your job, right?
I guess it had enough uniqueness that nobody seemed to challenge the patent aspect of it. I did think about patenting it, but I never did really patent it. It was expensive enough, and things going on at the time, it just seemed a little out of reach, affordability. And I think if I had have patented it, it wouldn't have made any difference now anyway, because the patent would be expired.
Right.
But the filter has become much more popular than I ever expected it would. My goal was to make a filter that was very simple in design and was made with discrete components and didn't use any special integrated circuits, because I was quite gun-shy of integrated circuits always being available. There were some special integrated circuits that some filter designers used back then, and I wanted to be able to build this filter forever in case these integrated circuits became obsolete, and indeed they have become obsolete.
Right. Right.
You can still get them, but they're not manufactured anymore. And so I basically want to make a filter that had a simple design so it could be built easily, and also would use discrete components that would always be available. And and it had to sound good too. And I finally came up with a design that seemed to fill those three requirements. I liked the sound of it. Everything I designed, the bottom line was, did it sound good? And so I finally came up with a design that I thought was simple, easy to build, and had a good sound.
Right.
To me, it satisfied my desires for a filter sound.
Sure. So now, what I'm curious about is you dropped some hints. I mean, obviously, you are an accomplished musician if you're able to go off and work on movie soundtracks and stuff like that. I mean, there's a level of accomplishment that's required just to be able to do that. But you also have enough electronic chops to be designing modular synths just because you wanted to, even before you got hired to do it. Which came first, and which really represents sort of like the passion for you?
Yeah, it's hard to say because they both were developed simultaneously. I fiddled around with electrical things and technical things from a very early age, but I was also grew up in a classical music environment, and I was trained, traditionally I was a trumpet player, and my mom was a very great keyboard player with perfect pitch and all that, but she could never get me to practice the piano enough. I think her patience finally ran out. Said, "Oh, let's have him play the trumpet," So I never. My sisters all became good piano players, but me and my brother just never did quite get with the schedule of practicing required to be a good keyboard player.
Right.
So, but I was trained musically, and in college I was studying music, and I was studying music performance. That was my major. The head of the music department, I was riding on a bus with him one time because he was also director of the band, and he was talking to me. He says, "You don't need a degree to perform, but if you're ever going to teach music, you need a degree for that. So really, you ought to change your major to music education rather than music performance." And at the time, it made enough sense. I thought, okay, I'm going to change my major to music education. And after doing that for a little while, it just dawned on me, like, when I graduate from college, I'm going to become a music teacher. I'll probably be a high school music teacher or something, and that is just not my personality. I just
it didn't sit well, huh?
Yeah, I thought, I can't see myself being a music teacher.
Right.
I just don't have the personality for it. So I dropped out of college and never did really get a degree. I had about 3 or more years of accumulated college time, but I just never did get a degree. And also, I thought an alternative to this would be to get an engineering degree. I have a lot of abilities in the engineering electronic world, but mathematics was not my high point, and so I figured if I'm going to go into engineering, I'm going to have to go clear back through dumbbell math, and that didn't appeal to me. So I left the college and went to work for an electronics company, and it was a really great environment. I learned a lot about electronic design just rubbing shoulders with all of these engineers. And I was what you call an engineering technician. I was a person who would assemble circuits and make them work.
Right.
I got good at the practicality of making them work, and I understood how they worked. I had a real good flair for how electronic circuits worked and gained the ability to design them. An electronic circuit simulates a computer. Every electronic circuit you make simulates a computer in the same way as a computer can simulate an electronic circuit. So I had the ability to do all the mathematical things that needed to be done in design, because you put a circuit in front of yourself, it's acting as a computer. It figures out values and everything that you would use mathematics to calculate. That worked out pretty good. That was kind of the philosophy that I got into designing circuits. And anything I didn't understand about how a circuit worked, I was around an engineer who could explain it to me. I was pretty good at building electronic circuits before working there, but my skills really grew being in that environment, really understanding circuits. I got hired there because I did have some electronic abilities. When I left college, I don't know, I liked the college environment, but it just wasn't comfortable in it. And I remember about that time driving down the street, looking at a guy selling newspapers on the side of the street, and I looked over and I said, that might be what I'm going to end up doing, but that's just my personality. If that's what I end up doing, that's the way it's got to be,
The way it's going to go, right.
But I remember resolving myself that might be where I'd end up.
Sure.
So anyway, I didn't like college enough that I remember thinking that, A lot of it's probably immaturity thinking too, But anyway, I was always played around with electronic circuits, and at that time I went to an agency, an employment agency, and I told the guy, says, I'd like to work in electronics, And the guy says, well, have you been to an electronics school? And I said, no. He said, well, go to an electronics school and come back when you've had some experience. I went to a second employment agency, and I told the guy, I do a lot of electronics. I've experimented a lot. I'd like to find a job in electronics. And he said, well, there's a place down there in Salt Lake that we might be able to get you started with. And he connected me with them, and that's how I got started with that company. I went down there and started working for them, and they decided, so they let me start working, and it was a full-time job. But it was in a section where we just made drawings. It wasn't assembly drawings. It wasn't really circuit-oriented.
Right.
But they had another department, the engineering department, where they had what they called, engineering technicians. And I thought, they got an opening there, and I decided, I'm going to try out for that. I'm going to tell them I'm interested. So the people in the electronic department, at first it was the testing department where you test circuits.
Right.
And they says, well, we'll give you a test. They gave me a test, and it turned out really good. They were quite impressed. And they let me work over there in the testing department. And I gained a lot of feel because they had really good equipment and stuff that I didn't have my hands on. I was able to get a feel for it. And after working there a year or two, an opening came up in the engineering technician department. And I told them I was interested in that, and they interviewed 8 people from the test department to select somebody. And I was lucky and was selected to be an engineering technician. I showed the main engineer, the guy who was in charge of the engineering department, things I was working on, things I was interested in and had built. And I think he liked what I told him, and they hired me as an electronic test technician or electronic engineering technician.
Right.
And that was where I really got to play with circuits the most. And
yeah, I've actually talked to a few people that have gone through that, and in fact, they said that environment ended up being an amazing education because, first of all, you're dealing with having to find out why a circuit might or might not be working properly, but also you're around these engineers and you're getting to see them at work, and there's something about that kind of being in that kind of milieu that makes you actually engage in the engineering concepts at a deeper level than just studying out of a book or in school.
Yeah, that definitely is the case. I think in a lot of cases when you're learning in the books, they hit you with all of the stuff that's non-intuitive, and it's hard to relate to the actual thing that's going on. When I was in high school, they had 2 electronic classes. They had first year what they call Radio 1, and the second year was Radio 2. And the first year, we spent actually building radio circuits. We actually built them and made them run, made them work. And the second year was more of the theory kind of stuff. We were studying the theory of these circuits. That worked really good because we all got our hands on these circuits and radio circuits and building them and getting a feel for them. And just about everybody in the class would build their own radio and make it work. And then the second, so we really had a feel for it and an interest in it, and knew that we could build something to work. In the second year, we learned more of the theory of
why
what was going on.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, Faraday's laws and all this stuff, you know. So that worked out to be a very good environment. That was really something that influenced me quite a bit. And then after high school is when I got interested in synthesizers and working in electronic music and working at this company where I was immersed with all these engineers, and it was very educational.
So what was the thing that got you interested in music electronics?
I was, trained musically, mostly in the classical realm. I played trumpet in the Utah Symphony. I was studying trumpet from the principal trumpet player in the Utah Symphony. And at that time, people were saying the Utah Symphony was among the top 10, even back then.
Sure.
And I had the opportunity to play in it, so I had a lot of experience in high school and college. I played in the symphony orchestra that they had there and also concert band. So I had a lot of experience performing, and sometimes I'd play solos, because my mother could accompany anything I wanted to play. So it was easy to go and perform like a trumpet solo at different places, different occasions.
Sure.
So I'd play trumpet solos, and I played in the orchestra and the band. So I had a lot of experience playing music, reading music, and just performing. And also my mom and dad, they both sang in the Tabernacle Choir, so they got free Utah Symphony tickets, which were, at that time, they performed in the Tabernacle. So I was able to go to almost every Utah Symphony concert for several years with free tickets.
All right.
My parents usually wouldn't have time to go, and so I'd always get one of the free tickets, and so I went to a lot of Utah Symphony concerts. So I not only was studying music then, but I actually was able to go listen to it perform.
Sure.
So there was a good musical environment, but I also liked playing around with electronics and chemistry and different things. And I had kind of read about electronic music in some books. There wasn't anybody in the area that I really knew of was into electronic music, but it just kind of fascinated me, so I just kind of experimented around with circuits that could produce sound. I made some really crude things that made electronic sounds. One of the first things I made was an electronic theremin, and played around with that, and then that just kind of grew. Or a person loaned me a little device that you played the trumpet through a microphone, and it would divide the sound into lower octaves.
Okay.
And I was fascinated by that. Put that into an amplifier. So one of the first things I ever built was kind of like that frequency divider. At the time, I couldn't afford to buy one, so I decided to build my own. So I made a thing that was divides by octaves. And so that was one of the first modules I ever built, was something that would take a sound and play it 1 and 2 octaves lower. And then I expanded on that. One of the modules in my modular system is called a frequency divider, and that's how it got started. I think I'm unusual in that I have some facility in electronics and in music. I've met few, if any, people that understand electronics and music to the degree that I might be conversing with. Like most musicians I know, especially the really good ones, are not into electronics, so you wouldn't expect them to build their own electronic modules. And most of the engineers that I know do not play professionally. There are some that do, but they would not. You wouldn't expect them to be symphony members or something like that.
Right.
Even though they might be good at music. So there's very few people who you might say have done professional music and professional electronics at the same time. So there's a compromise there. I'm not the greatest musician around, and I'm not the greatest electronic engineer around, but I do both, kind of thing.
Well, but it also, being in that position, though, also puts you in an interesting spot, because especially, I'll tell you, my introduction to you actually was as an EVI player. I mean, way back in the day, I remember seeing pictures of you playing the EVI and listening to that music, and, you know, all the way back to the Apocalypse Now soundtrack, but, you know, even throughout some of the studio work you did and some of the other stuff you did, and it was such a defined sound. To, in a way, you became the very best person at your instrument because you designed your own instrument, right?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. I designed I always design the instrument for my own liking, and then if somebody else likes it, that's fine. but the priority is if I think it feels good, then I'm happy with it.
Right.
And generally, that transfers over. Other people liked it also. So yeah, I think that was my criteria.
Sure.
Was that it's got to feel good. I need to be able to play with it. I need to be able to do what I want with it. It took a number of years to make it work. Yeah.
Well, what was the process like of coming up with the EVI? Because it seems like a pretty complicated thing, really.
Well, in a way, it's quite simple. I mean, if you compare it to a hard drive that goes in your computer that you can buy for $60, it is very, very, very simple in comparison. You know, the degree of technology that goes into it. Making synthesizers, I naturally did it with a keyboard to start with. A keyboard is one of the most natural things to build a synthesizer because it's very simple. You push a key down, and you can close a switch, and you can define a pitch, you know, and how fast you hit the key can also be sensed. But so a keyboard is a natural thing. To make a wind instrument is a little more complicated, and I figured, well, I'm not a very good keyboard player, even though I was doing a lot of electronic music in a little studio I built in my basement for modern dance people, and I was using keyboard because that's all the way I had to play the synthesizer.
Right, it was the easy way to do it, right?
Yeah, and sometimes I'd play my trumpet through that divider thing, and so I had a couple of ways of doing it. But I finally got thinking, well, I wonder if it's possible to make something that fingers like a trumpet, you know. I don't know if it'd ever be practical, but it's worth experimenting. So I experimented with it. And, of course, a trumpet, you play with your embouchure being changed, you know, to get up and down the harmonics. I just couldn't find a practical way to do that. You know, there are certain things that you can simulate, that you can approach, but you can't perfect them, and that's one of them.
Right.
So I decided I'm going to make something where the left hand does those overtones rather than try to do it with my embouchure. It turned out to be a much more practical thing. Mm-hmm. So a compromise between what's practical and how different is it than the actual instrument. So I made the EVI learning a left-hand technique to handle the harmonics overtones rather than actually playing them with the embouchure. And that was a situation that required quite a change in playing technique, but it was a change that was doable. And to this day, that's the philosophy of the EVI. So the EVI is not as marketable as, say, a keyboard synthesizer because trumpet players can't just go into a store and try it out. Oh, yeah, I like the way this feels. It takes some commitment and time to do it. It's kind of like a clarinet player learning a bassoon, let's say. So it wasn't as easy to market. But then after I started working in the studios, some of the woodwind players down there, they thought, boy, he's doing pretty well.
He's getting good gigs.
I always felt like it was miraculous, actually, that I did as well as I did. But it was something, you know, I still look back, it was a miracle that I got into playing there like I did. But
right.
And it was just hard to explain. But anyway, some of the woodwind players approach me and they say, could you make a thing like that that's like for woodwind players? And I said, well, why should I do that? There's the Lyricon. You know what? I don't need to bother making a woodwind one, because there's a Lyricon. Just play that. And they said, well, we've tried the Lyricon and we like yours better. Maybe the sound or something.
Right,
they said, yeah, we know about the Lyricon, but we like your instrument better. So they convinced me to make a form of woodwind, which is I call the electronic woodwind instrument, EWI. And so I started making prototypes and selling them to woodwind players down there. And it actually got to the point after a while that there were woodwind players playing similar stuff that I did, enough that I was actually sort of competing with them, actually, in the studios.
Right.
And it finally got to the point where composers would, well, let's see, do we have an EWI player available, or is there an EVI player available? There's several EVI players down there, too, that I built them for. And when they did the music copying, they have a stamp that says oboe, a rubber stamp at the top of the page says oboe, trumpet, Well, they made a stamp called EWI, and it became one and the same. If I worked for somebody, the music might say EWI at the top. So if an EWI player could come, they would play an EWI. If an EVI player came, they played EWI part on EVI. It became kind of known as the same instrument as far as copyists were concerned.
I see, okay.
So all the music was... so it finally got to the point where they say, oh, we've got an EWI player coming in, And so finally I decided, let's call that electronic wind instrument instead of electronic woodwind instrument. So you could think of a EVI as an EWI. It's electronic wind instrument. They're all in the same category. And now
both of those devices originally had like a synthesizer connection, right?
Yeah, in the early days, I built the sound modules to go with the instrument.
Right.
And then when MIDI came along, I interfaced these things to synthesizers, external synthesizers.
Okay.
So when MIDI came along, I was able to translate that into a MIDI interface. There was a guy in California named Jim Cooper, who had designed a MIDI interface for the Lyricon, and I approached him and had him tailor-make some that would work for the EVI, and so it was called the Jim Cooper interface, but there were changes I needed made, and it was too hard to get him to make the changes. He was busy doing other projects, and I needed things that were, I needed changes and modifications in this MIDI interface, which was a microprocessor.
Right.
So it was frustrating. I couldn't get him to do the changes I needed. Up to that point, I was an analog circuit designer. I didn't know hardly anything about microprocessors. I just decided one day I've got to learn about microprocessors or get left behind. It's just that simple. So I wasn't able to get source code or anything from him. So I took what's called a double EEPROM that had the program on it. And I sat down one day and I decided if the microprocessor can go through all of this code and decode it in 10 milliseconds,
so can you.
I ought to be able to do it in 6 months. So that's what I did. I was able to take the machine code out of the chip and write it down on paper, and I started looking up what each command was, and it took me many months to finally figure out what that code was doing. But by the time I did that, I was able to make changes of my own. It was a Z80 microprocessor.
Sure.
And so every time I needed something different, I was actually started writing the code in machine language. It was very laborious, and because at the time I didn't know how to use an assembler. And finally, after several years of doing that, I finally learned how to use an assembler and write assembly language so I could write this code more efficiently. And so the original MIDI interface grew and grew and grew, and pretty soon that interface thing that I was programming became basically the whole system
Right.
that controlled the synthesizer. So it was like taking the back of a truck and finally turning it into a big house, size-wise and everything. The microprocessor size of memory kept getting bigger, and I finally started writing with assembly language, and finally grew into my own system. But it all started with Jim Cooper's interface,
right.
and the fact that he couldn't give me the source code really was a blessing.
It was a turning point for you. Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
it was. It was because up to that point, I really didn't even know why they had microprocessors. I just thought they used them so they could run a bunch of fancy lights,
Right.
This one guy made an interface, a thing that was called a Moog synthesizer that was digitally controlled with a microprocessor. And I remember looking inside of that. I had to look inside so I could figure out how to interface the EVI to it.
Right.
Because a friend of mine had bought one of those. And
so like the Moog source or something like that?
yeah, that might be what it was. It was a source, and it had a knob that would control all the parameters. You push a button and which parameter you wanted to. I think that's what it was. It was the source.
So,
And I was looking through that. I was pretty good at looking inside synthesizers. In those days, they were simple enough. You could actually look inside and see what they were doing.
Right.
I never liked to copy people, but I liked to see how people approach things.
See how they solve their puzzles. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember one day I decided I'm going to see how they make how's their envelope generator work? I can see the filter here. I can see the oscillator. How are they making the envelope generator? And I tried to find the envelope generator circuit, and I couldn't find it. And I finally realized, my goodness, the microprocessor is acting as the envelope generator.
Eat that up. Right.
And that's when I realized that, oh, gee, a lot of these things they can simulate with the microprocessor. And it kind of was an eye-opener that's why they use microprocessors. They can simulate all of these devices right in the code. Right. And so that was a learning experience for me.
So this work that you were doing with the EVI and the EWI, was that under the Steiner-Parker label, or had you spun off on your own at that point?
Yeah, I had spun off on my own. Before I went to California, I had some partnership problems, not with Parker, but with a third partner that we had.
I see.
Had some severe partnership problems, and the company was dissolved, and
I see.
All that stuff. So that ended.
I see.
But there were enough Steiner-Parker things floating around that's how the people approached it and remembered it.
Right, and then at some point you took the EVI and EWI and started working with Akai on that, right?
Yeah. It was interesting how that came about. There's a friend of mine who I had built an EWI for, one of the first people that I'd built an EWI for. His name was Joel Peskin, and he had a friend named Andy Muson, and they approached me one day and says, gee, we ought to try to sell these things. And those two guys had another friend, his name was Matthews, who kind of had some associations with Akai, and they got talking to him, and they were thinking, gee, Akai might be interested in this. And so Joel and Andy approached me and said, they're having a NAMM show, let's fly back there and show this to Akai and see if they be interested.
Right.
I told them, I says, I've had a lot of people talk like they want to build it. I'm not willing to invest the money to fly all the way back to Chicago and show it to them, because things like that usually, people always talk like, oh yeah, let's build that, Nothing ever comes of it. And I said, if you and Andy want to fly back there on your own and show it to them, if they happen to go for it, I'll split it with you. I'll split the royalties with you. And they decided, okay, we'll do that. So they flew back to the NAMM show and approached Akai, and Akai actually was interested and took us up on it. Kind of to my surprise, but...
Did they ever produce an EVI? I mean, the EWI
they did.
is still
they did. In the beginning run, they did make some EVIs.
Okay.
But it was understood at that time that we're going to do it limited because they do appear harder to market.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to make them, and they did make a run of them, and there's still people playing those now.
Yeah, I have good friends for whom that's still their primary interface with electronic music.
Yeah. So I have an interesting story. A guy named Bruce Cassidy, who's a trumpet player with Blood, Sweat, and Tears, he bought an EVI. The first day he had it, it was experimental for him, but he figured out some things he could do, and I understand that he actually got up on stage the first day he had it and did some things with it. but I'm sure it wasn't what he does now on it, And he still plays it. One time, I think this might have been before we moved to California, Blood, Sweat, and Tears came to Salt Lake area, up in Park City. They gave a concert. Bruce Cassidy said, come on up and see the concert, and then come backstage and we'll visit. So I went up to the concert, and this was quite a while later. He played a pretty impressive solo on the EVI on that concert, but this was after he'd gotten good at it, I went to see him backstage in the intermission, and the guard says, oh, no, you can't. Nobody can see him back there. I'm not going to let you in. And I told him, I said, well, go back and tell Bruce Cassidy that Nyle Steiner's here to visit him. So anyway, the guard did that, or the security guy. And so Bruce come out and said, oh, yeah, come on in. He's fine. We went back there and talked to Bruce. And while we were talking to him, Clayton Thomas, the main guy in Blood, Sweat, and Tears, he came up and talked to us, and Bruce introduced us to him and said, this is Clayton Thomas, and Bruce said, this is the guy that invented my EVI. And as soon as Bruce said that, the guy, he jokingly came over and put his hands around my neck and like he was trying to strangle me. He says, do you realize how many times, how many hours we had to listen to this guy practicing that thing on the bus? They were traveling around on a bus,
Oh, that's hilarious.
But now he's finally gotten good at it, So Bruce must have spent a lot of hours on the bus while they were traveling, practicing that thing and to get good at it, and they were hearing that,
Well, I imagine it had to be pretty difficult for trumpet players to go from embouchure to like a hand movement. That had to be a real switch in their head to be able to make that change.
Yeah, it is. Some people do it easier than others. Some people just it's not their thing, and other people, hey, I can do that. And it actually makes the instrument easier to play. Really, it's much easier to play than a real trumpet is.
Sure, right.
You have unlimited range, same range as a piano. High notes are no problem, but if you get the right feel, you can still simulate the strain of high notes, or you can simulate the ease of high notes, like a violin might have. You know. So.
Right. Is anyone still producing an EVI?
I'm redesigning it right now.
Oh.
With a thing called an Arduino, and there are people around the world who are experimenting with them. So
interesting.
But I don't think it's ever been fully produced on the scale that the EWI has.
Right.
I think too many companies have been too gun shy of it, because of its marketability. But I think if one could sell cheap enough, a lot of people could say, "Hey, I'm going to try that."
Right.
It would probably become even more popular than it is, but it's still probably in the esoteric realm of musical instruments. But there's a number of people that are making them, or at least experimenting with them.
Sure, interesting.
And I'm in the process right now. I'm just about ready to have some made with a thing called an Arduino, and it's definitely much simpler than it
Z80,
has
right?
been.
Yeah.
The Arduino is much easier to program, much more compact, has much more in it, has all the interface circuitry, most of it in there. And then I find that I've never been interested in playing virtual synthesizers, because I've never been interested in carrying a computer around and setting that up every time I play.
Right.
But now there's one called a Raspberry Pi that I'm using as a sound module, and it's like the size of a bar of soap, and I don't even need to have a monitor or a keyboard to play it. I just turn it on, it boots up, and then I can play that. So that's what I've been playing for the last several years.
Yeah,
because it's so handy and small.
It's an amazing little device, but what are you running on it that's making the sound?
I'm using a program. It's open source. It's called Fluid Synth.
Oh, okay.
But I'm using a thing called QSynth, which is Fluid Synth in a GUI wrapper, a graphical interface.
I see. Okay.
And so I can program the Raspberry using a monitor
Uh-huh.
and a keyboard that I plug into it, and then I can unplug the monitor and keyboard and just carry the Raspberry Pi around. And one little USB power supply will power the EVI and that, and I can perform with that. All I got to do is plug into an amplifier of some kind, or even earphones, and it'll run quite a while on a battery, a 5-volt battery, USB charger type battery, and that's been really good. I really like that. It uses a type of sampling format called sound font, which was invented by EMU Systems back in the 90s. It's a format I like because it's a format that the samples are there. If you want to take the samples out and use them in some other environment, you can.
Yeah, it's like a portable format, right?
Yeah, it's a portable format. It's also capable of playing with the filters and all the controls you need, along with playing the samples. Some of the earlier sound fonts that I played with only played the sound fonts, and I had to go through another virtual filter to control them. But this QSynth, Fluid Synth, it's capable of, and it's all built in the sound font parameters, the filtering, and even the reverb. This QSynth has its own reverb. I think it sounds quite good enough that I use it and feel good about it. So it's been a great thing. It's free software, it's open source, and it plays better than a lot of the things would. It plays with a reasonably good smoothness. To me, it plays well enough to carry around and perform with it.
Right.
And so I really enjoyed carrying everything in just a little bag instead of a whole bunch of
flight cases, right? Yeah, I mean, it's comparing that to when you were like hauling around a modular or even a Synthicon for that matter. I mean, it's a completely different show.
Yeah, in Los Angeles, even the Iwi players, we didn't have to carry as much stuff as the keyboards, but we still had a cartridge company.
Right.
Professional cartridge companies would bring our stuff to the studios. But now I can do almost everything I did with all that heavy equipment. I'd have a rack mount. I'd have, like a standard rack mount full of modules, and then I'd have stuff on a keyboard rack kind of thing. And the cartridge people would set it up. They were quite good at it. They had all the cables color-coded, and you'd walk in the studio, and they'd have all the cables plugged in and everything. And basically a matter of firing it up and hope everything fires up okay.
Right.
So it's changed a lot as far as what you have to carry around.
Now we've talked a lot about the gear, but one of the things we haven't talked much about is the actual music. Now you've done some electronic music works of your own, right? I know that you've got a thing out there called 3 Movements for Tape, I think. Right?
Oh yeah, that was a long time ago. That was way back in the modular synth days when I had my own studio in my basement. The music back then was more in the realm of the electronic, kind of atonal type of stuff. I have a lot of background in that kind of music, atonal and kind of sound colors and things like that you put together.
Right.
That title, I believe that's what you're talking about. I didn't do a lot of composing like a person. That's all they do in their life is compose. But I did do a number of electronic things for modern dance, Ryrie Woodbury Dance Company, people like that.
And then when you were doing studio work, you did a lot of like film work, but didn't you also did a lot of just sort of like regular studio gigs, right?
Yeah, they were all the standard go in and play with the orchestra type of, it was, I was like one of the orchestra, and a lot of those things I would set up out with the orchestra. I would sit out next to the woodwind players usually.
I see.
Would set me next to the woodwind players.
Interesting.
Even though I might be playing brass parts or woodwind, they'd have me play a number of things.
Were you set up with the amplifier? Did you have to set up with an amplifier?
Yeah, I had an amplifier that would sit by me just so that I could hear myself and the people around me could hear what I was doing. I also had an earphone that I could hear myself, but with the earphone, the people around me couldn't hear what I was doing, so I'd set the amplifier at a level that they could relate to what I was doing just as though it was another acoustic instrument.
Sure.
And so I would adjust the amplifier volume separate from what I was sending into the control room.
Got it.
I was one of the few people, electronic musicians, who had their own separate switch to turn their amplifier on and the feed to the booth. Most synth players didn't have the ability to turn their output on and off what was going into the booth.
Right.
And so the electronic players are always doing stuff that was complicated. So every time there was a break or every time the composer wanted to rehearse the strings or something, the electronic musicians were all doodling around trying to get their sounds right and trying to make sure everything with their feeds not turned off into the control room.
Right.
Sometimes the control room would say, "Hey, can you guys
just shut up?"
Yeah, can you guys shut up for a few minutes? We're trying to do this. I would turn my amplifier off and my feed off, but I could still hear it through the earphones. I was able to doodle around all I wanted, get my sounds, and trying to figure out what I'm doing. Then when the time came to do a take, I'd flip that switch on and be able to play. And every once in a while, we'd be halfway through a cue, and they'd stop, and they'd say, "Hey, Nyle, we can't hear you." I'd say, "Oh, sorry, I forgot to flip my switch on," So that was a hazard, but the overall balance, everything, the advantage of being able to turn my feed off really gave me an advantage to be able to work on my sounds when I had to be silent.
Yeah, indeed.
But the other musicians didn't have the ability to build such a thing. Right. Most of them. I think there's a couple that did. Anyway, that worked out very well. There was a percussionist down there who, very bright guy. His name was Larry Bunker. He played everything, and he had to run around all the time. He might be playing marimba, he'd run over the timpani, and the next few beats he has to run over and play a glockenspiel or something. Sure. So he designed his own RF transmitter. He would plug the click feed to this RF transmitter, and then he had a portable earphone FM radio that he would wear, and so he could hear the click feed while he was running all over the place. Sure. He wasn't tied down. He was pretty bright. He designed a pretty good way of broadcasting, and other people, when they got on to the fact he was doing that, he worked a lot, so a lot of the other percussion people would carry around their own FM radio. Right. And when the session started, they'd say, "Hey, Larry, are you broadcasting?" And so the question was always asked, "Are you broadcasting?" And so they'd put their earphones and FM radio on, and they would listen to the click through that.
That's hilarious. That's great.
I didn't need to do that because I sat in one place. I was able to. I didn't have to worry about wireless.
So now, you talk about like traveling around and carrying your instrument and this Raspberry Pi with you. What kind of playing are you doing now?
I don't do a lot. I just kind of play just little local things. Every once in a while, somebody wants me to play at a...
Come sit in or something?
The biggest thing that I play up here, I do very little, but they have this annual event up in Midway, Utah, and it's an outdoor thing where people set up booths and they sell things, and it's bigger than the state fair. I haven't been to the state fair for a while, but this thing I think has more people packed in this area than the state fair has, at least from what I'm perceiving. And they also have entertainment there. I play that. They have this stage where they invite groups to come in and perform. And sometimes a person wants to make a CD, like a pianist wants to make a CD of them doing solo piano. They might have me add tracks to it.
I see.
So I've gotten to where people like to have me listen to what they're doing. They might record their whole thing and then bring it to me, and I'll put tracks in behind it, like string tracks and wind player tracks, things like that. So it kind of sounds somewhat orchestrated. So I've been doing stuff like that. The story that when I first started working on Apocalypse, that was my first real professional recording thing, and it was unusual. It was in San Francisco. I have a interesting story about how I got into that. I worked with this lady that used to live in Salt Lake, because her husband worked at the TV studios, but she was a very gifted musician and pianist. We got working together, just kind of experimenting with music, and then they moved to San Francisco. A number of years later, she called me and says, I've gotten involved with these Italian movie guys. They're doing a movie, and you should come down and audition for them. It'd be great to get you involved down here. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. I'll come down there. And I put a modular system in the car and a synthcon and my EVI, and I took off down there to San Francisco. And this Italian guy, I tend to be pretty naive. That's the trade-off of my electronics, is that I tend to be naive about who's doing what. The Italian movie director was Francis Coppola, and he was doing Apocalypse Now. David Rubinson, who was, I think, Herbie Hancock's producer, was kind of in charge of the music for Apocalypse Now.
Right.
And she finagled him to have a meeting with me. I'll drive down there and he'll meet me and I'll go in and talk to him. In the meanwhile, I had a little EVI that was slightly smaller than a shoebox, and I had a 2-inch speaker in it, which was very low quality, but you could at least practice with it. So I could just open the shoebox, play a very simple synthesizer, and practice. And I decided to carry that with me the day I met Dave Rubinson. So anyway, I went into his office, and he said, well, I appreciate you coming, but we just don't have any time to audition you. We don't have, we've got everything we need here, but I appreciate you coming. And so I thought, okay, well, it doesn't hurt to try to get in on these things. You won't get anywhere if you don't try.
Right.
And I called my wife and said, well, doesn't look like I'm going to be doing the movie, but I'm glad I came down. And if you go back about an hour before that, before I went into his office, I had my EVI there carrying that little box, and we weren't even supposed to bring anything. We're meeting people. And some people in the studio said, what's that box you're carrying? And I said, oh, it's an instrument. And so I said, well, get it out and play it. So I patched into their big speakers and everything and started playing, and everybody was really impressed that was there. There were some technicians there and some people there.
Sure.
They were really impressed when I plugged it into their speakers. And then after that's when I went in to see Dave Rubinson, and he said, well, we're sorry, we don't have any, we're just not going to be able to do this. So anyway, after that, I called my wife and said, it doesn't look like I'm going to be working on the movie, but David Rubinson was there, and he said, since you're here, if you want to watch the movie, we're gonna run the movie on the screen here unfinished. It hadn't even been scored yet, but it was it's unfinished. You're welcome to stay and watch if you'd like. And I thought, sure, I'll do that. And so they had a small theater there, and I sat down in one of the seats there, and I sat that shoebox size EVI down at the side of my chair and was watching the movie. They had a temporary score that they were doing, and they came to a break in the movie to switch reels or something, and so we were sitting there with all the lights on, and halfway through the movie, and Francis Coppola pokes his head in the door, and he happens to see my little box sitting down by my chair, and he points to that and he said, is that thing I've been hearing about all afternoon? He says, I got to see that. So I got it out right there, played it in front of him with the 2-inch speaker. showed him what I could do with it, and he said, "We got to have that in the movie." So after the screening was over, David Rubinson approached me and says, "We've got you scheduled to start in the studio Monday morning."
What a story. That's amazing.
So if I hadn't carried that with me, I think things would have been different. My whole career would have been different, I think. But I just decided this thing is small enough. I'm not supposed to take anything. We're just going to be meeting people today. But this is small enough I can carry it, and it won't be, it won't be obnoxious or anything.
Right. What an awesome way to make it happen, though. That's really great.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always felt like if there's any opportunity that's going to make you visible or something, take it,
Right.
And that was one of those opportunities. And when I mentioned I went into the studio before I met Dave Rubinson, when I walked in, there was a guy from local music store advertising a Yamaha CS80.
Right.
I think that's, and he was showing all these things he could do on that, and I remember thinking, he was showing vibrato and stuff. I was thinking, man, I can do that really well on here. So after he got done, I plugged in, and he was quite impressed. And the guy that was demonstrating the Yamaha CS80, he was hoping to sell one to the studio there. He was impressed with what I was doing, and we became good friends. And he invited me over to functions at the music store when they were giving demonstrations for instruments. He had me come over, and we'd play together on these music demonstrations given at the store. The store is called St. Regis in Lauenburger. So it worked out with them, too. It was like I got to play with those guys a couple of times. It was a lot of fun doing that.
That's awesome.
But the Apocalypse was my main start. That was the first real professional thing that I had done, and that was about the time the instrument had become developed enough that I could play it professionally,
right.
And play it in a professional manner. One of the things that influenced me when I was designing this instrument was years earlier. The first one just was a switch. You blow on some note plays like pushing a key.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't have breath expression and all those things. It was kind of like, well, if I figure that out, that'll come later. And I was thinking, what is this instrument really meant to do? Is it meant to be electronic and go through effects pedals? Maybe that's what I should be doing. Concentrate on effects because it's more straightforward. You run your thing through there and you use expression pedals and stuff like that.
Right.
Or should I go the hard route and make a breath transducer that works proportional to breath pressure and human vibrato? And one night at a Christmas party, my brother was playing a violin solo, and it really became clear at that time that's the direction I need to go. I need to be able to play like my brother can play that violin,
right.
With human expression. So that was the route I went. You go that direction, you can still go through effects pedals. So, but anyway, I'd heard my brother play many times, but at that one time, when I listened to him play that violin solo, it was like, it's clear that's the direction I need to go with this. I need to make it humanly expression. And so I went that direction, developed breath control and human vibrato and things like that, as well as the sound modules.
Right, but that's probably why it also got why really well trained musicians gravitated towards, because it felt like a real instrument then, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the case. Because even today, when I play for older people, they instantly like it. And people who have gotten my age, I'm among that group now. People who are elderly people have had plenty of time to figure out what they like and what they don't like.
Right.
They've listened to music all their lives. They know what they like. And whenever I play for a group of older people, they like it instantly. They come up afterwards and say, that sounded so good, which is a good sign, because people, you don't have to acquire a taste for the sound. It's a sound that you can like right away. And of course, young people like it also. The fact that people can like it right off the bat is a good sign that it's not something you have to get used to like.
Right, indeed. Well, Nyle, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. I blew way past my time limit that I was going to have. I didn't want to bug you for a whole afternoon, but wow, what an amazing chat. I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, I'm glad you felt it worked out. So
yeah, it was amazing. Thanks so much, and I'm gonna keep in touch, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk some more soon. Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. Nice talking to you.
It's great talking to you. Bye now.
Okay. Bye.
So obviously I'm traveling right now, so I hope you don't mind a little odd sound here as I use a headset at the airport, but got to do what we got to do. I want to thank again the zZyzx Society for supporting and helping make this podcast possible. I also want to thank you, the listeners, for continuing to stick with me, for helping build the numbers, and for giving me the thumbs up wherever you do. One of the things I would ask is if you have a chance, check out what we're doing on either Spotify or YouTube. We've got feeds going there now, and just having a couple of views or a couple of subscriptions would probably help our efforts there as well. Beyond that, I'm going to let you go. We'll catch you next week. Bye.